Dr. Lamb, I just want to take you through a couple of quick logistical slides. We have some folks that I certainly don't recognize their names. I'm always excited when we get new registrants for these. So just a brief overview of who the Northwest Gas Association is. We're a trade association representing the 6 natural gas utilities and 3 pipelines operating in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. You can find more information on our website. One thing we're pretty excited about, in about a week or a week and a half, you're going to see our 2015 Outlook study released. We'll have an announcement on that going out to our email. It'll be on the website, and we'll be promoting it all over the place. So keep an eye out for that. That's sort of our keystone, cornerstone, foundational document we release every year. So we're excited to share that, and hope you'll be excited to read it as well. So just a couple of upcoming events before I set the tone or get the ball rolling on the actual webinar here. Next week, we have our annual energy conference. If you are going to be in the neighborhood and you haven't already registered, there's information on our website, and we're really excited about the turnout, the agenda. It's going to be a great one. Also, our next webinar, which will be on Thursday, June 18th, we'll be discussing our outlook, which I just talked about. My boss, our executive director, Dan Kirshner, will take attendees through the big new developments that are in the 2015 version. So keep an eye out for a registration page on that in the next week or so as well, right around when you see our Outlook study being released. With that said, just a couple of logistics here before I turn it over to Brian Lamb. Questions could be submitted 2 ways, either via the chat window that you'll see down there on your menu for GoToMeeting. And that's totally a fine way to submit questions. If you're a little more shy, you can always email them to me. You can just respond to the emails I've sent you over the last couple of days. I will monitor the questions. If it's something that's more clarification based on something Brian is talking about right then, I'll butt in and I'll make sure to ask him. If it's something that we can hold off until the end on, I'll ask the question then at the end, and I'll keep track of what comes in as it does. One other thing, keep an eye out for our post-webinar survey. I'm actually recording this webinar, and I'm hoping, if everything works out technology-wise, I'll be able to post it as a YouTube video. So we'll have that on our post-webinar page, which to see that video and to get a copy of the presentation and to access a link to the actual in-depth study that Brian wrote. That'll all be on that post-conference page, which you'll get to by filling out our survey. We love feedback, so please do that and keep an eye out for that. That'll probably come out later this afternoon or early tomorrow, depending on when I get everything uploaded. So with that said, I will turn it over to Brian. And Brian, I'm gonna make you the presenter here, so let's see if that works. And while you're getting set up, I'll just read your bio very quickly, Brian, if that's okay, so everyone's all up to speed. Brian Lamb is Regents Professor and Boeing Distinguished Professor of Environmental Engineering in the Laboratory for Atmospheric Research in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Washington State University. He's been at Washington State since 1979, where he has directed a wide range of atmospheric chemistry, pollutant transport, and air quality field programs. Under his direction, WSU has completed several research projects focused on the impacts of global change on regional air quality. Dr. Lamb has also been involved in national field programs to measure methane emissions from natural gas systems and landfills, and he pioneered the use of tracer ratio methods for these measurements. He received his PhD from Caltech and his BS in chemistry from Idaho State University. So with that, I think I need to unmute you here, Brian. I will turn it over to you, and thanks for being here.
Sure, Ben, and thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing looking at methane emissions from local distribution systems. I thought before we talked about our study, I would show just one slide to help put this in context. The Environmental Defense Fund, starting back 3 or 4 years ago now, undertook a large effort to take a new look at methane emissions from the entire natural gas supply chain. So they worked with industry partners in the different sectors and organized research teams to make new measurements of emissions in the different sectors. So this includes production areas, gathering and processing, as shown in the slide, transmission and storage, local distribution, which was the focus of our work, and then refueling stations and natural gas fueled vehicles. So there, a number of these studies are now published. The green stars indicate where those studies have made it to the publication stage, and others are in process. In addition to specific studies looking at different sectors, there were also a number of studies that were taking a bigger perspective. We call these top-down studies, where aircrafts or measurements from towers, those kinds of things were used to look at regional methane emissions for different production basins. And then they had a couple of other, they have some pilot projects that they're sponsoring, a gap filling project, and then there's a project synthesis that will attempt to bring all of this together in one publication. So that's kind of the big picture look at all of the work that EDF has helped sponsor and coordinate. And as I said, our particular piece of this pie is just the local distribution systems, and that's what we'll talk about today. So let's go to the next slide. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time talking about why I look at methane emissions from natural gas distribution systems. I think we're all aware that methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and there's a lot of interest in emissions from that. I think a key point, though, is that the methane emission factors that are currently used in U.S. EPA greenhouse gas emission inventories are, for the most part, based on studies that were completed in the 1990s. Back in 1990, EPA with the Gas Research Institute, GRI, sponsored a similar comprehensive look at the natural gas supply chain. And in fact, WSU was involved in a portion of that work. But the results from that study that was published in '96 basically are the emission factors used today in the greenhouse gas emission inventory. So it's timely to take a new look at what the emission factors are for the supply chain. For our particular study, in terms of the boundaries, we start at the city gate where gas is transferred from the transmission pipelines into the local distribution system, and we included both the transmission and distribution side of the city gates. We looked at emissions from various metering and regulating stations within the local distribution systems, and we also looked at emissions from underground pipeline leaks and leaks from services. We included up to the customer meter, although we ended up actually not making measurements on customer meters because there was a recent study in 2009 by the Gas Technology Institute where they measured 2,800 customer meters, and so we didn't feel the need to try to repeat that. We did not look at emissions downstream of customer meters, so any end-use emissions were not included in our particular study. So overall, our focus was on emissions from underground pipeline leaks and from metering and regulating stations, including the city gates. It's worth just looking at how the current emission inventory is compiled. Emissions are considered in different categories for underground pipelines and services in terms of the pipeline type, cast iron, unprotected steel, protected steel, and plastic. Various categories of metering and regulating stations, primarily in terms of the inlet pressure for different types of facilities, customer meters, mishaps and dig-ins, and maintenance activities. And in each of these different categories, then, there's an emission factor for that category, which is then multiplied by an activity factor. So for metering and regulating stations, it's the number of stations in that particular category times an emission rate per facility. And then once you've done that simple multiplication for each of the categories, you simply sum up to get the total emissions for the distribution system. And as I mentioned before, current methane emission inventories for local distribution systems uses emission factors that are essentially unchanged from the 1992 study. In terms of what we did, we conducted a nationwide field study to get a new look at emissions from pipeline leaks and M&R stations. The field work was conducted during the summer and fall of 2013. We ended up with over 400 new emission measurements for pipeline leaks and M&R stations, about equally split between pipeline leaks and M&R stations. And this is more than double the number of measurements that were conducted during the 92 EPA GRI study. And as a result, it's the most comprehensive set of direct measurements yet for distribution systems. The funding was provided by the Environmental Defense Fund and a number of local distribution companies, as well as the American Gas Association and some of their associated member companies. In terms of where we went, we sampled.
Can I stop you for a second?
Sure.
We had a clarification question a couple of slides back. Not the last one, but the one before, if you can jump back very quickly. It says, why is there such a range of, next one up. There you go. Why is there such a range of 34 to 84 times? That makes sense?
I think you're jumping way ahead to the final results.
Okay.
So I think.
Okay, we'll hold off on that, and maybe.
I think they're referring to the range of the emissions that we ended up with at the end. So we'll get to that.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Brian. I wasn't sure. I thought if that was a clarification one or not.
Sure. So in terms of where we sampled, these are the 13 partner companies that where we sampled in each of these local distribution systems. And as you can see, we basically went from the East Coast to the West Coast and pretty much from north to south across the U.S. It's worth considering how representative these 13 companies are for the national system. It's only 1% of the 1,400 companies in the U.S., but these 13 companies have 20% of the services, 16% of the pipeline miles, and provide 14% of the natural gas delivered. So on that basis, it's a pretty reasonable cross section of the national distribution system.
Okay, Brian, I do
to make sure we were.
Okay, yeah. Can I ask another question? Going back to the
Sure.
question I asked about why is there such a range? That was actually on climate potency of methane. Why is it so broad, 34 to 84 times as potent as CO2? Why such?
Oh.
It was a little further back than I sent you before.
Yeah, it depends on the time frame that you use to calculate the climate sensitivity for the different gases. So that's why if you look at a 20-year time frame, you get one result. If you look at a 100-year time frame, you get a different result.
Got it. Perfect. Thanks, Brian.
Sure. All right. So within each of the distribution areas where we did sampling, we selected one city or region within a given service area to concentrate on. And then for that target area, we obtained the company list of current surveyed pipeline leaks. And from that list, we randomly selected the pipeline leaks and M&R facilities that we were actually going to go measure. So we tried to set up a method where we were, there was no bias in the way we selected the leaks to measure or the M&R facilities to measure. In each of the target areas, then, we were there for on the order of about a week to 10 days, and we ended up collecting 10 to 20 pipeline leak measurements and emissions data for 10 to 20 M&R stations. So that was kind of the process we went through to select the actual measurement sites that we measured. In terms of how we did the measurements, just very quickly, for M&R facilities, we would go to a selected facility. We would first use handheld sniffers and screen every component and device in the facility for leaks and emissions. For any components that had an indicated leak or emission, then we would measure the actual emission rate for that component using a high flow sampler. The high flow sampler, some of you may be familiar with, it's a vacuum device that basically pulls a very high flow rate of air from around the leaking component such that it completely captures the leak, and it passes that captured stream then past a set of methane sensors where the concentration of methane is measured. We also measure the flow rate of air through the sampler, and and we also measure the background concentration. And after subtracting the background concentration, we can multiply the concentration of the leaking component times the flow rate and get a methane emission rate for that component. We repeat that at all of the leaking components and simply sum those up to get the total facility emission rate. Because of that individual component measurement approach, we also conducted what are called tracer ratio tests at some of the M&R stations as a quality assurance check on the high flow sampling results. For tracer ratio method, and by the way, this was the method that was used in the 1992 study for M&R facilities. There was no high flow sampling done at that time. In the tracer ratio method, you release a tracer at a given facility, and then you go downwind with an instrumented van that's fitted with a sensitive methane instrument, and in our case, a tracer analyzer. We use sulfur hexafluoride as the tracer. And you can make measurements of the downwind methane and tracer concentrations, and knowing the tracer release rate, you can use that information then to back calculate what the methane emission rate is for that particular facility. So it's a nice technique in the sense that it integrates over the facility and it provides a good QA check on the summing up of the individual high flow sampling results at that facility. So we applied this technique at a subset of the M&R facilities where we made measurements. For pipeline leaks, we developed a flexible surface enclosure. That's the yellow enclosure shown in the photograph. So we would go to a surveyed leak location, and first we would map the surface area of the leak using a portable sniffer, as shown in the photograph. And then we would use that information to grid out the number of locations where we would deploy the surface enclosure so that we can completely capture the surface expression of the leak. And then with the surface enclosure, we coupled that with the high flow sampler to measure what the emission rate was from the area enclosed by the surface enclosure. In some cases, in a lot of cases, we only had to use 1 or 2 enclosure measurements to capture a leak. I think in the worst case, we used as many as 29 placements of the enclosure to completely capture a leak. All right, so that's very quickly kind of what the study, how the study was conducted. What did we find? This is a quick list of some of the key findings. What we saw overall is that methane emissions from local distribution systems have decreased quite a bit in the past 20 years, although we do see significant variation by region. A key factor are upgrades at M&R stations, along with changes in pipeline materials, better leak detection, and new regulations have all contributed to this decrease. A key aspect of these measurements is that for both M&R stations and pipeline leaks, when you look at the distribution of measured emission rates, you find that it's highly skewed where just a few facilities or a few pipeline leaks contribute a large fraction of the total measured emissions. And as a result of that skewed distribution, when you go to calculate an emission factor, what you find is that you end up with very large uncertainty ranges in the overall emission factor for a particular source category. And I'll show a little bit more of that in a few minutes. A key feature is that M&R stations have undergone significant upgrades, and our emission factors for M&R stations are substantially less than those from the 1992 study. We were surprised at how big a difference we saw from 1992 to the present, and so we actually went back and revisited 9 of the sites from the GRI EPA study and found indeed, and I'll show a slide on this next, we found more than a factor of 10 reduction in emissions for those sites. An important part of the M&R story is that vented devices at M&R stations where they exist are often the largest emission source within a facility. These vented devices, by design, when they activate, release a small puff of methane, or they can, depending on the age and design of the device. And so we found that odorizers and pneumatic controllers, where they existed in M&R stations, were often the largest emission source for that facility. For pipeline leaks, our emission factors were also less than in the 92 study, certainly not to the same degree that we saw for M&R stations. But for pipeline leaks, it's not as obvious why we see these differences. Certainly there have been changes in company survey and repair methods and safety regulations, and those probably contribute to a population of smaller leaks. But there were also differences in the way the measurements were made in 92 compared to the way we made measurements. In 1992, the pipeline leaks were measured using a pipe isolation approach, where for a selected leak, they dug down and isolated the pipe on either end of the leak, pressurized that section of pipe with a measured flow of gas to maintain that pressure, and that measured flow rate then became the leak rate. That leak rate was at the pipe surface, and there was a correction applied to try to account for any oxidation of methane in the soil column over the leak. The pipeline leaks selected in the 92 study were sections of pipe scheduled for replacement. So these are pretty significant differences compared to the way we use the surface enclosure measurement and the way we selected our leaks for measurement. All right, so just a little bit of data to show. I mentioned that when we got into measuring the M&R stations, we were surprised at how large the differences were from 1992, and so we identified 9 of the higher emitting M&R stations from the 92 work and went back and repeated measurements at those facilities. And at 8 of the 9 facilities, we found pretty dramatic reductions. So for example, at facility A in 92, it was about 160 grams per minute. When we went back to that same facility and made measurements, it was less than 40 grams per minute. At the one facility where this reduction was not true, facility D, the operators told us that essentially there had been no change to that station in the last 20 years. So one of the things we did when we saw these results is that we surveyed our member companies, and we also worked with AGA to survey AGA member companies to find out what kind of upgrades and equipment rebuilds had been done at M&R facilities. And in all of those, both of those surveys, we found pretty substantial indications of complete facility rebuilds or equipment upgrades at the different facilities. And so it seemed pretty obvious to us that the big reduction in emissions that we found can be attributed to the fact that these facilities have been modernized to a substantial degree over the past 20 years. For pipeline leaks, I mentioned that we see this skewed distribution, and this pie chart illustrates that. So this is a pie chart of all 230 of the pipeline leak measurements that we made. And what you find is that the three largest leaks that we measured account for about 50% of the total emissions we measured. And this really isn't a surprise. It was true in the 92 work. It's true in some of the other EDF studies in the other natural gas sectors. And it was true for pipeline leaks and also for M&R facilities. So when you have this sort of skewed distribution where a few leaks account for a large fraction of the total emissions, and you use this information to calculate emission factors, you end up with a very high or large upper confidence limit based on the skewed distribution. And we explicitly use statistical methods designed to treat these skewed distributions to estimate the emission factors and the upper confidence limits. So when we take our new emission factors and combine them with current activity factors, these are the kind of results that we get. So first, looking at pipelines and services, our study on the left, our current estimate is about 200 gigagrams per year. But again, we have a very large uncertainty. That's what the error bar indicates. And that error bar comes close to the current EPA 2011 emission inventory. But nonetheless, there's still a substantial decrease based on the mean emission factors. For equipment, the light blue color in the center shows the dramatic reduction in emissions from M&R stations. And because of that dramatic reduction, we see a much smaller error bar associated with the equipment categories, where we just see that very large reduction in M&R facilities. Customer meters, as I mentioned earlier, the GTI results from 2009 agreed within about 30% of the current EPA emission factors, so we didn't really change those emissions. We did some additional surveys to look at maintenance and upsets, but really didn't come up with significant changes in those emissions. So then when you combine the leaks from pipelines and services with the emissions from the different equipment categories, you end up with the total distribution emission inventory on the right side of this. And our total emissions then are about 300 gigagrams per year. The upper bound, 95% confidence limit, is about 800. As compared to the EPA current emission inventory, which is at about 1,300 gigagrams per year. So we end up in the end with a fairly substantial decrease, whether you're looking at the mean emission factors or the upper confidence limit. One thing we did is we took the emission factors on a national basis and combined them with pipeline miles and numbers of services on a regional basis. We didn't see any significant differences in the emission factors by region, and so we used the national emission factors for this analysis. But what you find when you look at the differences in pipeline miles and services by region is that the eastern region, where we have older pipeline systems, accounts for 35% of the total U.S. methane for pipeline leaks, whereas the western region contributes only 17% of the total emissions. And in line with that, leaks from cast iron and unprotected steel pipeline, the older pipe types, account for 70% of the eastern emissions and almost half of the total U.S. emissions. On the other hand, plastic and protected steel account for 92% of pipeline mains by mileage, but leaks from these systems contribute only about 20% of total U.S. emissions. And then finally, services account for about a third of total U.S. emissions for pipeline leaks. So we see big differences by region due to the differences in the pipe types that are inherent in the older versus the newer systems. So overall, our national emission inventory estimates are 36 to 70% less than the current EPA inventory estimate. And this is due just to the new updated emission factors from our measurement program. It's pretty clear that significant upgrades to M&R stations have resulted in factors of 10 lower emission factors for M&R stations. The pipeline leak emission factors, as I mentioned, are also lower than previous estimates. Here it's not as clear, but probably due to improved leak screening and repair methods by companies. And there were also the differences I mentioned between the 92 work and how we did things in our study. And then finally, because of the differences in pipeline types, there are large variations in emissions on a regional basis. So that concludes kind of a quick overview of the study that we did. We just have this last slide thinking about next steps. I mentioned that EDF has sponsored some of these top-down studies, and the EDF work and other work by other researchers. Generally, we see a pretty large gap between top-down versus bottom-up comparisons for urban areas. And that suggests some next steps that we can think about. In general, in terms of developing bottom-up emission inventories, we need better treatment of all urban sources. And this includes end-use emissions for residential, commercial, and industrial customers, emissions from LNG storage, from CNG vehicles and refueling stations, which EDF does have a study that's in progress. We need to make sure we do a complete accounting for landfills, wastewater treatment, and other biogenic sources of methane. If we think about the pipeline leaks, we need to continue to work to improve leak surveys to try to better more efficiently capture the super emitter leaks, the really large leaks that account for the bulk of the emissions. And the same thing is true for facilities as well. So better process for identification and repair of super emitters. People are working on mobile mapping methods where you take a methane instrument in a vehicle and drive along city streets. And there are methods now under development to try to estimate leak rates from that mobile mapping process. And my personal opinion here is that I'm not sure we're quite there yet with mobile mapping to be a really reliable way to do quantitative surveys of leak rates. But that's certainly a technology that's developing. And finally, one last point. I mentioned that our field measurements were during the summer and fall. We didn't do any wintertime measurements, and so there's perhaps we need to think a little bit more about any seasonal effects on the methane emission factors. So I think that kind of wraps it up, and I'd be happy to try to answer some questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Brian. I have a couple of questions here. Since we just wrapped up talking about leaks, why don't I start with that one? You talked about super emitters and some of these large single-site emitters. Do you have any insight into what are the reasons for the majority of leaks, these smaller leaks, bad gaskets, cracks, poorly sealed threads, anything like that?
You know, I don't think I can comment on that. I imagine the folks on the call might have a better idea than I do. In our approach, we didn't ever dig up the leaks. So, you know, we don't know exactly what the leak situation was. We were making measurements at the ground surface, not disturbing the pipeline in any way. And so we really don't have a catalog of what the leak characteristics or what the pipeline characteristics were associated with the leaks, other than we knew the pipe type and we knew whether it was a service or a main.
Got it. Okay. Another question for you here, Brian. Did participating LDCs define, constrain, or otherwise have input into where you could or could not take measurements?
No, we tried to really bend over backwards to avoid any kind of bias associated with that. I mean, obviously, these 13 companies volunteered to participate, and they gave us access to facilities, and access to their lists of surveyed leaks, and that was essential in order to make these sorts of direct source measurements. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, we tried to use a random approach to select the leaks we actually went to measure, and the same with the M&R facilities. At the very beginning, when we selected the area to measure in, we tried again to make it our own decision on where to go. We got feedback from the companies in terms of, yeah, logistically that works, or here's some potential problems with that area, and so there was a little bit of iteration on that. But generally, we tried to the maximum extent possible, pick the areas and pick the actual leak locations where we made measurements.
Mm-hmm. Great. This question is maybe a little bit outside of your purview, Brian, but someone asked, did we quantify what is coming off landfills, cattle feedlots, and wastewater treatment? Now, I think the EDF studies are only on the natural gas value and delivery, supply and delivery chain, right? This chain of stuff.
Yes and no. In our particular study, we only looked at pipeline leaks in M&R facilities. And we did that so that we could develop these new emission factors to go into the emission inventory. For some of the top-down versus bottom-up studies that EDF has helped with, particularly in the Barnett Shale region, there were measurements with aircraft and on the ground that looked at a wide range of different types of methane sources. And certainly in developing bottom-up inventories for the Barnett Shale, all of the sources were incorporated or included in the bottom-up emission inventory.
Got it. Thanks. Got a couple more questions here, Brian. And folks, if you're mulling something over, certainly feel free to send it to me via email or via the chat thing. So here's another question for you, Brian. Can you comment a bit more on the activity factor determination you referenced in the emissions calculation?
We use the activity factors that EPA uses in their current emission inventory. So these, in our case, it was at the time, it was the most recent, the 2011 emission inventory. So we use the EPA activity factors.
Got it. All right, here's one. Someone's asking for your opinion, Brian. So in your opinion, is the CO2 byproduct versus methane leakage trade-off paying off in the overall climate change calculations metrics? That makes sense.
Well, I think you're talking about if we switch to methane, we reduce CO2 emissions, and at the same time, if we have a large leakage of methane, we may offset the reduction we get by making that switch.
Exactly.
Certainly for distribution systems, the decrease in methane emissions that we see over the past 20 years is a positive sign in terms of making that switch. When we start looking at other sources in production areas and other parts of the supply chain, I'm not sure that we see those kind of, we don't necessarily see those kind of reductions, and in fact probably perhaps increases. But it's still my impression, and again, EDF has not come out with an overall synthesis publication yet, but it's certainly my impression that we're probably going to end up below the break-even point where it makes sense to make that switch.
Yeah. That's what we've been seeing too from monitoring these. Here's another question for you. The largest leaks. What was the ground composition or the surface area of the ground the leaks were coming out of?
So it's kind of interesting when you start looking at these leak measurements. The three largest leaks that I showed in that pie chart were from three different pipe types. One of the leaks actually had a very large surface expression. I think it was the one where we had to use 29 placements of the surface enclosure. So the surface enclosure is 4 foot by 4 foot, so 29 times that was the surface expression. The second largest leak was actually from a protected steel pipeline running along underneath a bridge in an urban area. And so for that one, it was very clearly just a point source. And we actually measured that using the tracer ratio approach because we couldn't get to it to use the surface enclosure. And for the, let's see, I think for the other leak in the top three, it was also a very confined leak. It didn't have a huge surface expression. But it, like I said, it varied quite a bit, anywhere from one surface enclosure up to as many as 29.
All right, perfect. Well, I don't have any more questions here. We'll do a quick going once. If anyone wants to get one last question in very quickly. I'm not seeing any. So
if folks have questions down the line, I'd be happy to try to answer anything by email.
Great. It's okay if I share your email address on our little
Sure.
post webinar page, Brian?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks, Brian, for being here. And thanks for those of you that joined us on the call as well. I know there's not a whole lot of feedback on a webinar, Brian, but I do have some virtual applause for you. So there you go. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and keep an eye out for the for our post-webinar survey, which will get you to the post-webinar page, and you'll be able to access the presentation and this recording. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for arranging this.
Yes, thanks, Brian.